All right. So tonight's topic is about dyslexia and thinking about understanding what dyslexia is and also understanding so then what that would look like in terms of our students and different characteristics of dyslexia. So I'll go through, we'll dive deep into the actual definition of dyslexia, and then we'll spend a little time on some practical elements, thinking about from an assessment perspective, and then also some instructional things to try to give you some things to think about and some, practical takeaways as well, mixed in with the content information. So within this topic, there is a lot of, it's a complex, reading is complex, the underlying um, characteristics of dyslexia are also complex. I want to talk a little bit about some of the words that are going to come up today. So one being neurobiological. And so that term, think of your brain, the neurons in your brain. So your nervous system is what's sending messages throughout your body. So neurons in your brain are constantly sending messages back and forth. So this term is going to come up when we talk about dyslexia, so the communication that's involved with different neurons in different parts of your brain. So part of one of the areas of the brain that's communicating is your phonological processing system. So that would be within your auditory system. And then more specifically, within that auditory system, you have a phonological processing system that is processing the sounds of language. So this, so you're that's what the system that's perceiving speech right now as I'm speaking. I'm using my phonological system. It's sending messages to my mouth to help me form the words that I want to say. And then your phonological system is perceiving the words that I'm saying. And then as far as reading and spelling is concerned, you use this phonological system to understand this idea that words can be broken down into smaller bits of sound. So that's a key piece. And there's also what we call this orthographic processing system. The phonological system is more in the front left of your brain. The orthographic system is in the back left. And that's the system that's processing letter symbols and words. So print, that's processing print. It's in your visual system and it's processing the actual, the physical characteristics of those alphabetic symbols and the words themselves. And then somewhat related to that, so those of us who become proficient readers, the large reason why that's happened is because we've stored a lot of words in that back part of our brain that we can recognize very, very quickly when we see those words. Like this word relevant that's on the slide right now. When you see that, you're recognizing that in an instant. And or if you have, it's because that word is stored in what we call the visual word form area. So that's also in the back of your brain. And that's what's allowing you again to become an automatic proficient word reader. You end up with tens of thousands of words stored in that word form area. And these are words that you don't need to decode anymore that you recognize in an instant. So tens of thousands of words end up in that word form area. All right, so two other terms. So one being a phoneme. And phoneme is what we use for an individual speech sound. And then a grapheme is what we use for the term of how we spell a phoneme. So the phonemes would link back to your phonological processing system, and the graphemes, or the way we spell a phoneme, is going to link back to your orthographic processing system. So let me know, do you have a thought or comment at this point, or can I clarify anything? So please feel free to do that at any time. All right, so let's go into the definition of dyslexia, which is not light. There's a lot of terms, and it's this is a dense definition. So this comes from the International Dyslexia Association, which is a really wonderful website. They have a lot of links you can click on, a lot of information about dyslexia. And this was a definition that was created with a group of researchers came together. And this definition has been around for quite some time now. I'm kind of waiting. I feel like at the, around the time when I was expecting them to think about this and maybe, make some tweaks, but I haven't seen anything yet. But so here's what our definition of dyslexia is: a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. So characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. That's often unexpected, so often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So, there's other things cognitively that you can do really, really well, including perhaps understanding language as it's spoken to you. But then when you get to written language, the issue is converting written language into spoken language. Um, and then the provision of effective classroom instruction means that you have received some pretty good instruction in word reading and spelling, and you still have this really profound difficulty in word reading and spelling. And then there are some secondary consequences, which would include some issues of reading comprehension, which are largely resulting from the fact that you're a struggling word reader. And when you're a struggling word reader, it's really hard to comprehend what you read because your focus, cognitive attention and focus is on trying to convert those words back into spoken language. Your brain is trying really hard to interpret that print and turn it into spoken language. And then reading comprehension is difficult because you don't have the cognitive, desk space to be able to focus on what does this mean. So that's where comprehension or the understanding of what you read is considered a secondary consequence. Also, quite often, if you do have a word reading issue, you're not doing as much reading, or when you do read, you don't read as much. So then you can have this cascading effect of that impacting your growth in vocabulary and background knowledge. So that's it, right? Fairly simple, straightforward definition. Do you have a question? Can I clarify any of that? I am going to break it down.
I would add, this conversation came up a few times in the last month. Often in Montana, if you have a student who with an IEP or who has received some kind of diagnosis, what it's called in the IEP is a problem with reading comprehension. It's almost always called reading comprehension. But as you can see here, that's not where the problem is way farther down the rope than that. So I just wanted to mention that because some of you might wonder, you may not get a diagnosis or information on an IEP that a child is dyslexic. It'll say reading comprehension. And that's where you have to dig deep down to see, parse out the actual problem.
And how you would want, in terms of the legal terminology, so having a learning disability in word reading would be synonymous to say somebody with dyslexia. So a specific learning disability in reading that's specific to the word reading process. So we'll break this down a little bit, and I'm going to go a little bit away from the definition and help frame this. So it is the term is specific to a word reading issue. So you could, right, if you think about the simple view of reading, with word recognition times language comprehension equals your reading comprehension, so you can have an issue on either side of that equation. So you could be a very proficient and accurate and fluent word reader, but really struggle to understand what you're reading. So that is not what we would consider dyslexia. Dyslexia would be on the word recognition side of that equation. So by, technically definition, it's an issue with word reading. So it's important to think about, so all of us are not, none of us are born with a word reading brain. That has to be created. And that's going to be created through formal reading instruction. So there's certain neurons that are going to start activating and processing and connecting with each other to form this proficient reading brain. So the way that happens, so there's neurons in your brain that take on this job that were naturally designed to do other things. So these neurons were designed to do other functions, and they get what we call reconstituted. So these neurons now pick up this additional job of 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 being able to read words, of being able to convert print back into spoken language. So that wasn't their original job. So think about in that context, and you think about a lot of students who struggle then in this word reading process, right? The struggle is with reconstituting these neurons and getting them to do this other job that they weren't, you know, naturally designed to do. So then that links back to this idea of dyslexia being a neurobiological issue. So it's not from, from a lack of instruction, it's from the organization of neurons in your brain and how those neurons are trying to communicate and they're trying to reconstitute themselves and they're struggling to do that. So, one thing I always try to remind myself with students who really struggle with word reading is it's not their fault. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. It's neurobiological. So these neurons are having trouble processing the sound information and the print information and connecting it together, which we'll get a little more specific with that. So because of that, right, so then that impedes this ability for this child to create and build this proficient word reading system or this word reading brain. So in all of this, so there is a visual component to reading. However, dyslexia, this is a really important point. It's considered a language-based disorder as opposed to a visual disorder. And that's a really common misconception. So often when you hear about dyslexia, it's about letters being backwards and mixed around. And, that's not, from the research, that's not an accurate description of what dyslexia is. So it's considered a language-based disorder. So after, your visual system is looking at print, and that print, though, is not getting processed by your eyeballs, it's getting processed in the back of your brain, which is then trying to communicate with the front of your brain. And that's where the issue is. So it's not a visual issue. There are a small subset of students who do struggle to read words because of visual difficulties. But that's a smaller subset. The larger subset of students who struggle to read words has to do with these connections between the back and the front of your brain. So this now looks random to me. I'm sure I've created this presentation at this point, but you also want to think about these students who, this is neurobiological, and that you don't really think of dyslexia as fixing it. There are things that we can do instructionally to help that student create this word reading brain that they've been struggling to create. Um, it does tend to be fairly persistent. Um, so in this statistic really shows that 3 out of 4 students who are diagnosed with dyslexia in elementary school still have these struggles to read in high school. So it can take a lot of time and effort to help, a student become a more proficient word reader. And sometimes it will get better but it's still a battle. So when you think about them with these students, if we go a little deeper, so it's a word reading issue. So underneath of that, so often there's an issue in that phonological processing system, which if we back up again a little bit, your phonological processing system is naturally designed to do what it's doing right now, to process the words that I'm saying and to help me say the words that I want to say. It's not naturally designed to think about speech in little bits of sound. So that's where this is where the difficulty lies with students with dyslexia. So maybe an issue in that phonological system. Um, Usually there's going to be an issue with accurate word reading. Sometimes these students who struggle can be pretty accurate, but then they don't get to this level of automaticity. So when they see a word, it's often like they've never seen it before and they sound it out every single time they see it. So they can be accurate, but then not automatic and not fluent.
Craig, does that mean it's a storage and retrieval issue?
There's a component to that, correct? Yeah. So I'll show you an image of the brain scan that's going to come up on the next slide, and I'll make that point. So you want to think about this too in terms of a word reading, but also then sentence level and passage level reading. If you're not an automatic and fluent word reader, you're not going to be an automatic and fluent sentence and passage reader either. And then you're probably, if you're not an accurate and fluent word reader, it's highly likely that you're also not an accurate and automatic speller. There's a few, you'll see some exceptions to that. Generally speaking, most of us, even if you have characteristics of dyslexia, can decode better than we can spell. But there are some students where you see the opposite profile. Their spelling is actually really good, but they still really struggle to word read. That's a less common scenario. So if the child has been diagnosed with dyslexia and their verbal and language skills are strong, then these difficulties with reading comprehension are going to be secondary. And I'm going to come back to this point because sometimes students with dyslexia also have a language deficit. So you can have both of those things. And if you have both of those things, then your reading comprehension is really going to be a struggle. If you're struggling to comprehend because your attention and focus is on word reading, but even if somebody reads something to you, if you have this language difficulty, then you're going to also struggle to understand when something is read to you. So I hope that makes sense. It's a really important point. So in that case, if you are diagnosed with dyslexia and you also have a language issue, then that comprehension issue is then not secondary, right? Now you have two primary issues, understanding what you hear and what you read, but also reading the words themselves. Does that make sense? Okay. I want to do a little pause and then Jackie, could we set up a breakout? And I just want to give you a few minutes for just reflect and recite and be able to talk through with each other. So, it's good to be able to articulate or try to articulate. So based off of this information, so how would you describe dyslexia to each other? So what is dyslexia? And then also importantly, what is it? What is not dyslexia? I don't have the questions on the slide, Jackie, but that's that's what, try to articulate to each other what is dyslexia and what is not dyslexia.
There's at least 2 people in each room.
30-second countdown. All right, now we're back. So that time that you had to think through this a little bit and talk to each other, does anybody have a clarifying question? Check your mics. It looks like a lot of you, as you came back, are unmuted.
Oops.
All right. Okay. So if no questions, let me I'll continue on, show you a couple of visuals here that I hope will help us to understand this as best we can. So when you look at the left side of our brain, so this front part is where this phonological processing is happening. This is what's called Broca's area. There are multiple areas though that are activating in that phonological system. And then here's the back part of your brain where we call that orthographic processing. So this is in your visual system, and that's what's processing the letters, symbols, and words. And there's also an area close to here that's storing all those words that you can recognize in an instant. So that visual word form area is also in this area. This part here is where um, phonological information and print information are meeting and talking to each other. So this is where you would say sounds meet letters or phonemes meet graphemes. So when you look, so this is what a typical word reading brain looks like, or a word reading brain that's, proficient. So when you start reading, this back part of your brain activates first, then this front will activate, and then this part will activate, which that information is then coming together. So through the interaction then between that part in your visual system and this other part in your phonological system, that communication is what then allows words to get analyzed. So that's why it says word analysis. So a word that you see on the page you've never seen before, you're trying to decode it. That word is getting analyzed. And when you get enough exposures and practice with that word, it's going to store itself in that visual word form area. So for some of our students, and now coming back to that question, those words don't get stored well. They can still use this process to figure out what the word is, and they can maybe sound it out correctly, but then it doesn't get stored. So then when they see that word again, they don't recognize it, and so they have to redecode it. So then for spelling, when you are trying to spell that word and you go to the back of your brain to try to visualize the word, it's not there. So that's, somebody asked that question, is this, in part a memory, storage, and recall issue? And the answer to that is yes. Quite often, though, when you look at the brain imaging scans of students with dyslexia, often there's very little activation in this middle part where it says the parieto-temporal word analysis. So they're not connecting phonology to orthography, the print to the sounds. So those students, when that's not happening, when they see a word, the best they can do is guess. They just guess at what that word is. They often look at the very first letter and they'll say a word that begins with that same sound, but they'll look at the word cougar and they'll say cat. Right? They have no idea because that phonemes and graphemes are not meeting in this part of the brain. But you could have some communication, but you're still not storing it. So that back part, sometimes it's called the letter box. So processing the letters, symbols, and words. This front part, processing the sounds of language. And then this middle part where sound meets symbol. So here's another visual that came from some research studies. So looking at people who are illiterate and then people who are still struggling word readers who can't read words very well. And then brain imaging scans of people who have now become newly literate, so have learned how to read. So what's in yellow here is what the parts of your brain that activate when you're listening to spoken language. So that's the easiest to see in this image of the people in the study who were illiterate. So you can see, so in yellow, so they were being spoken to and looking at what activates in their brain. So that's very similar. With the literate and newly literate, it's just that the red is over top of the yellow, so it's hard to see the yellow. but that yellow is activating in all three of these brains. What's different though is what activates for written sentences. So if somebody who's literate sees a written sentence, this is the back part of your brain that it's activating, and then the front part activates, and then this middle part activates. Whereas if you're illiterate, the back part is activating, and then you see a little activation in the front, and there's no activation in the middle. So phonemes are not connecting the graphemes. When somebody then learns how to read, who couldn't read before, the brain imaging, their scans look very, very similar to somebody who's been literate. This does not mean that you're instantly a proficient reader. So when you become newly literate, this will be a process and there's going to be a lot of practice and time. But what's important is these parts of your brain do start activating and connecting. So you see that really clearly, right? The back part processing symbols, front part processing phonological, and the middle part where those connect. All right, question.
So if you have a student who like replaces a word, like if the word was pale, but they
Yep.
don't say or sound out pale, they just say bucket. Is that common? Is that for
Yeah,
dyslexia?
how old is the student?
6,
Mhm.
going to be 7,
Yeah. Yeah, I
and
would say that. And say
really
again.
struggles to decode or to all of that early literacy thing.
Correct. Yeah. So when you look at children who are doing that, they look at a word and they say something completely different. So there's multiple things that could be going on. If they're receiving instruction in the letter sound correspondences, so they know what sounds those letters represent, but they're not saying those sounds and they're just guessing. So that's like, that would be a symptom or characteristic of dyslexia. It could also be that they see the word, they see pale, and somebody's taught them the pattern, so they'll say, maybe they could say oh, so maybe they wouldn't say a, they'll say instead, but still not say pal or pale because they can't put sounds together, right? So you may not really understand how this whole system works, and then you're doing wild guesses, or you may have figured out how the system works, but you can't put sounds together. So anytime you try to sound out a word, you get stuck and you still can't say the word because you can't blend. And we'll come back to that. So when we look, at the brain science that's looking at students with dyslexia, so it's important to understand that so there are these brain differences and they exist prior to formal reading instruction. We wouldn't say that student at that time has dyslexia because prior to word reading instruction, you're not a reader, right? So you wouldn't get the label of dyslexia until you've been formally now taught the alphabetic system and you're being taught how to sound words out. Um, so when you look at the brain imaging scans of students with dyslexia, you literally see less gray matter in areas of the brain that have to do with word reading. So the gray matter is what processes the information. White matter in your brain is where the pathways, that creates the pathways from one part of the brain to another. So they also have less white matter tracks. So both of those really matter. You have less neurons in these parts of your brain where you need to be activating and communicating, and you also have fewer neurons that are connecting that information. So, right, consequently, there's less activation in those areas where phonemes and graphemes are processed and where they meet in that other part of the brain. And then you have less activation in this visual word form area because you're not storing words very well. So these students, the only way they're going to get a word stored in there is to visually remember it. And we just can't do that. We can't visually remember tens of thousands of words. without also using the front part of your brain. So often, so interestingly, and I haven't seen a good explanation of why this is, these students who struggle, often you'll see overactivation in the front part, but they're still not connecting to the back part. And then you also see in those brain scans, where you want to see activation on the left side, you see it on the right. And I haven't seen a good explanation of that either, but that's really typical. So there's right side activation, but not the left. All right. So, yeah, does somebody have a question or comment?
Yeah, Craig, I have an odd question.
Okay.
Does that right-left difference, does that have anything to do with handedness or any other kind of right-left brain hemisphere difference?
Yeah, so I would say to the first question, no, as far as I understand, with left hand, right hand. Um, the other question is a little trickier to answer. So I mean, there is, right, there's these structural differences. So because of those structural differences, this right side is it's trying to compensate and jump in and do this particular task, which it's not going to be able to do. So I don't know if that helps answer that question, but
It kind of does, yeah.
again, these areas of the brain that are getting reconstituted, specifically for word reading. So there may be all these other things that you can do just fine in communication between the different hemispheres, but not, still not, you're not able to connect these pathways that you need to for word reading. So I'm going to return back to this idea of a language disorder. So that the term for that right now is developmental language disorder, which means you have a difficulty in understanding language and using language. So that can be completely independent of dyslexia. So you could have one or the other, or you could have both. So the developmental language disorder, then that would make it hard for you to understand when people are speaking to you or when they read something to you. Whereas dyslexia, again, is with word reading. Interestingly, though, students with developmental language disorder and dyslexia often both have phonological deficits. In addition to the phonological deficits, the students with DLD have these additional language challenges. So there we'll measure like your receptive vocabulary, your expressive vocabulary, your sentence level, understanding. So they'll test low in a lot of these language areas, not just the phonological area. Interestingly, students who have these characteristics of a language disorder often are not good word readers. So there seems to be something, you're at a higher risk. So if you have this broader language issue, you're at a higher risk for developing a word reading issue than if you just have the phonological issue. And when you look at these students who do develop developmental language disorder and dyslexia, they have the most severe phonological deficit. So there are some students who we measure at a young age and they have a phonological deficit, but they don't develop dyslexia. They become an okay word reader. So the ones who develop dyslexia have a more extreme phonological deficit. So in these studies that look at students with the phonological issue versus the language abilities, so the ones who have the greater risk for word reading are the ones with the broader language issues. Some children with developmental language disorder who have less severe phonological issues then end up with a less severe word reading issue. So they have the broader language issues, but their phonological system is a little, better intact, and so their word reading issues aren't as extreme. So here would be a difference if a child just has dyslexia. When you read to them, they completely understand what you said and they can repeat back to you and they'll ask you questions and they'll interact. Whereas a child with DLD, when you read to them, they're going to struggle to understand them. Then again, you can have both. You can have both of those issues. So I want to switch gears. If you have a question, let me know. Otherwise, I want to talk a little bit about assessment and instruction. All right. So we have, the screening process is really critical in order to identify, so who are these students who have dyslexia? So I said before, if you're a pre-reader and you haven't been exposed, you haven't been taught how to read yet, then we're not going to say that you have dyslexia. However, we can still screen students who are pre-readers that have not been formally taught how to read yet, and we can get an indication if they're at risk for dyslexia. And so the way, in those screenings, so we're trying to predict who's going to have the word reading issue in the future. And if we know who that is, then we can do some things early on to help, prevent this word reading issue from happening. So early screeners are going to assess alphabet knowledge and really basic phonemic awareness. So usually what we consider the most basic phonemic awareness skill is if I say a word like popcorn, and you can tell me that popcorn begins with P. So that's what often in an early assessment to see risk for word reading, there's a first sound awareness task in there. So that's the most predictive skill at a young age. And it's really a combination of alphabet knowledge plus this phonemic awareness ability. And then also, so think back to what we just talked about. So early language screeners, so if you have one of those in place and you're identifying students with these broader language issues, some of those students are going to they're going to struggle with word reading. So also keep in mind in the screening process, there's always a bar. There's a bar set, and if you score above the bar, you're considered not at risk. If you score below the bar, you're at risk. There's no screener that can put a bar in a place that's going to 100% identify who's at risk and who isn't. So you're trying to put the bar in a place where you don't over-identify and you don't under-identify. If you move the bar up, right? So if you move the bar higher, the chances that you over-identify are going to increase, and then if you put the bar lower, or wait, did I say that the wrong way? Stop the recording. All right, bar goes higher. I say this all the time, and all of a sudden I'm like, wait, what? So if you raise the bar, then you're gonna get Jackie, more students who are gonna look like they're at risk, right?
Correct.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. And then lowering the bar, you're gonna get the opposite. So there's always this game that you have to play between over-identifying and under-identifying, but you can't ever make it perfect. So just know through your screeners that you're gonna identify kids who look like they're at risk and they're really not. You're gonna have kids that look like they're fine and they're not fine. All right. So once reading instruction begins, we still want to screen, but the screening is going to look a little bit different. So you're still probably going to assess, their alphabet knowledge or what we start to call grapheme knowledge. So do you know what a CH represents? Do you know what two E's represent? It's not just about single letters now. It's about these letter combinations that represent sounds. And then we're still going to look at your phonemic awareness, but typically now we're not looking at your beginning sound awareness. We're looking at, can you blend sounds together and can you take a word and pull sounds apart? And then we start looking at, once you've been taught how to read words, so we start looking at your ability to read words. So those those are the main tasks that we start screening for to see if these students are at risk or they're not at risk. So then as we continue on and students are going towards that end of first grade, second grade, third grade, the screening starts, not to have as much of the alphabet for the phonemic. And we just start looking at, are you an accurate and automatic word reader? And are you an accurate and automatic, passage reader? And if the answer to that is no, then often we have to go a little bit deeper to see, exactly what's going on with that child. So that's like really raw on what a screening process looks like. Often after a screening process, then we want to do something else that goes a little bit deeper, which we call a diagnostic word reading assessment. And then even if students are older, in the screening, often there's no phonemic assessment. So there will be in the diagnostic assessment because you need to know if they still, if they can't blend or segment, we have to know that. We also have to know, do they really have letter and grapheme knowledge? And if they don't, then we need to teach that. So this will be a little bit more involved and it'll help us figure out more specifically, where the issues lie. So let's switch now and think about, so from assessment, we've identified, where you are, and then so instructionally, then we want to target some certain things. So the first thing that I always look at is whether the child has strong phonemic awareness or not. If they don't, there's no point in doing anything else because you will not become a proficient reader unless you can blend and segment. So some of these students with dyslexia can't blend, and that's the scenario where they make wild guesses when they see a word, or sometimes they say all the sounds, but they still don't say the word. The first time that I was exposed to that, I was like, what? Like, just say the word. You said all the sounds, just say the word. But the problem is they can't put sounds together. So then in assessment, you want to see what they can blend and what they can't blend. So my first question is, if I give you 2 sounds orally, can you put those together? If I give you 3 sounds orally, can you put those together? And if the answer is no, then that's the instruction that I'm going to start giving you, which I'll show you here in a second. If you can do that, then my question is, what if I give you 3 to 6 sounds? Can you blend those together? And typically, as you get further on, with 4 sounds, there has to be a blend. With a single syllable word, if you give a child 4 sounds, there's a consonant blend in there somewhere, and that becomes much harder than to blend together. So that's what I want to know next. Also, I do want to make a distinction. Sometimes when you're seeing if they can blend phonemes, they can do it, but it's a struggle. And if it's a struggle, if they're not automatic, then we need to practice blending until you become automatic. So if you get no to any of these questions, then we're going to give you some instruction in blending. And this would be oral, right? You have to be able to blend or reading doesn't, it doesn't matter. I can't put print in front of you if you can't blend. So I'm going to start with 2 sounds and say, all right, I'm going to say 2 sounds. And you put those together to make the word. Ready? E. And then we have to teach them how to go me. Nice, good job. So starting with 2 sounds, and then we'll move to 3, and then maybe 3 sounds with blends, and then 4 sounds with blends, 5 sounds with blends, and so on. Does this make sense? They can't, and if you're trying to do this and they're struggling, then you're going to model that. Listen to me. A. If I put A together, I get ray. Do it with me. A. Ray. Nice. And then we'll keep moving along in this progression. So that's what's going to help them to decode. So remember with dyslexia, right, there's likely going to be a reading and a spelling issue. So the next thing you want to know is, can they segment? So it is possible that the child can blend, but they can't segment. So you're going to go through the same series of questions. If I give them a word with 2 or 3 sounds, can they tell me the sounds? And if yes, if I give them a word with 3 to 6 sounds with blends, can they tell me all the sounds there? And again, if the answer, and if you're not automatic, you can do it, but you're not automatic. So if the answer is no again, then you're going to give them explicit instruction in segmenting words into phonemes. The progression is a little bit different than blending because now you're going to start with, I'm going to give you a word and you're going to tell me the first sound. So I need to know if you can identify the first sound of a word. And if you can't, then that's what we're going to practice. After that, I need to know if you can identify the last sound of the word. And if you can't do that, then we're going to practice that. Then I need to know if you can do the middle. And then if you can't do the middle sound, then then I'm gonna teach you that. And then once you can do all these things, then I'm gonna give you a word like me, and I'm gonna have you tell me those 2 sounds, and then 3 sounds, and then 3 to 6. And so it'll look very similar, right? Except we're doing the exact opposite. Where I'll say the word oak, say oak, good. And now show me, oops, I was going to show you my document camera, but I can't. So, I usually have little chips or manipulatives, and then have this child, once I say oak, right, they're going to drag these down and show me oak, oak. And then I'm going to keep making that harder.
We've talked
So,
about this and practiced this instructional routine in a couple of different sessions, so I think it's not new to anybody.
great. So, the point to make here is if when you have these children who are struggling word readers, you need to ask this question: can you blend and segment? Because you can phonics a child to death, and if they can't blend and segment, right, they're not going to progress. Okay, so then from there, right, once they know how to blend and segment, then we're moving into decoding and spelling, and so this is with patterns. And you don't have to wait. As soon as they can blend 2 sounds, they should be reading words with 2 sounds. When they can blend 3 sounds orally, now we should put out a CVC words and have you practice reading and spelling or reading those. Once you can segment 3 sounds, now we're going to give you words to spell that have 3 sounds. So we're going to move into decoding and spelling. And there's some good tools like decoding surveys if you're not familiar with those. Jackie, would you post? You just type in some really great reading and post their website. So the really great reading website has some free decoding surveys that you can download. And so you want to get really diagnostic here and know what patterns the child knows and what patterns they don't know. Right? So you have, at the base level, you have to be able to look at a word, know what the patterns are, and know the sounds that those patterns represent. So we want to know what patterns do you know, what patterns do you don't know. So do you know digraphs? And if not, I need to teach them. Do you know how to read and spell words with short vowels? The answer is no, then I need to teach you that. And then, we want to progress through all these different patterns. Can you read? So pale, that was brought up earlier, would be a word, following this vowel consonant E. So can't read pale, then I need to spend some time, teaching you the vowel consonant E pattern. So let's go back to that question though. The child who couldn't read pale is saying something really crazy, right? So you have to back up and teach them how to blend or teach them that P represents P and the AE represents A and the L represents O. So they need to know the sounds of the patterns and they have to know how to push them together. So here's the, I forgot I had the website. So reallyGreatReading.com/diagnostics. We'll give you those 3 free decoding surveys. There's a pre-decoding survey if you work in preschool. There's a kindergarten survey. There's a first grade survey. And then there's just a generic one for second and third and up. So they have all your bases covered. All right, so I'll share just a couple more things really quickly. So when you're thinking about phonics instruction, so you do want to be really explicit. These students who have this word reading issue, they need you to be super explicit in teaching those sound symbol correspondences. So we talked about before how this often doesn't go away. So once you've taught one sound symbol correspondence, then you have to teach the next one. You have to teach the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Whereas other students who are building this proficient word reading brain, you don't always have to teach them everything because they start to figure some of this stuff out on their own. But quite often the students with dyslexia or word reading issues, they don't. And keep remembering you have to do the decoding side and the spelling side. You want to do both. And then when I frame instruction, I also like to think about, we can do instruction at the grapheme level. So here's a pattern, CH, tell me the sound. Here's a word with CH. And then here's a sentence or a paragraph that has words with CH. So you want to be at all those different levels. I mean, keep in mind if these students are also English language learners or have speech impairments, that you might have to have even more emphasis on the phonemic awareness piece. So the other thing to think about is blending. So since blending is so difficult, I want to show you a couple different ideas for blending. And you don't want to wait. If students can blend orally, and once they know a small subset of consonants and vowels, you want to start forming these words and give them as much practice as possible in sounding out words. So often, that's a struggle. Well, this is typically how we teach blending, where you go, eh, and then we're supposed to say thin, right? So some of these students with word reading issues and dyslexia will not say thin. So with these pauses in between, the pauses are just too much, and they can't hold on to all of this, and they won't say thin. So an alternative to that is what we call this connected blending or phonation. And so here, there will be no pauses. We'll go thin, put that together, and that should be easier for students to then say thin. So that's what we call connected. Or I'll do what's called vowel first blending. So the vowels are the trickiest patterns to read. So in vowel first, you're going to point right to the vowel, say what sound. They'll say if, and now we'll stretch it. Thin. What's the word? Thin. Good job. So here's that same thing looking at more advanced word. So for pounce, if we do it segmented, it would be ow. If we do it connected, it would be pound, pound. And then you can do the same thing, point to the vowel first. OU says ow. So this word is pound, pound. So the other way to frame that is stretched blending, continuous or stretched blending. And that should help them be more successful. All right, I think so, Jackie, we're just about out of time.
We
I'm
are.
gonna skip this encoding piece. Just same thing when you're spelling, you just want to make sure you have a very systematic procedure. So you can look back at this. I have that procedure written out for you. And then also keep in mind these students with word reading and dyslexia are going, even with really good instruction, are going to make a lot of decoding errors. So it's really important for you to help them correct those errors and keep, directing their attention back to the word and the part of the word that they're struggling with. Give them some time to look back at that word, try to figure it out. You can give them some little, scaffolding and support. But if you taught this, you taught them the patterns, you know, let them try to correct themselves. Don't say, no, that word is this, unless you haven't taught the patterns. If they make a mistake on a word and you haven't taught them the patterns, just tell them the word. But if you're practicing words that they know the patterns, then support them and redirect them and help them to figure out that word. All right. And if children are making way too many mistakes, then you have it's the wrong word, right? So make that easier. So there's another slide here. So if you're gonna, you will have to practice fluency with these students. So I just have a few tidbits about repeated reading, and then some do's and don'ts as you're working with these students with dyslexia. So don't give them clues to guess a word. You have to bring their attention back to the print. All right, question or comment?
Another big topic. But I did note in there, that, how do I want to say this? The best instruction that we give in tier 1 is also the type of instruction that children with dyslexia need. Right? So you notice in the definition that's despite good instruction, they are still struggling. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah. And it's often a case of providing more instruction and more opportunities and more practice. It's not really about trying to do something different. We know of one way to become a proficient word reader. So typically what they need is more. They need more of that instruction, more specific. What could be also, don't forget that part, the phonemic awareness. It could be more explicit instruction and phonemic awareness with the phonics. And then the fluency. All right. Well, thank you all for joining tonight. We'll hang out if you have another thought or question.